What's up, all you wonderful people? This is SMpsychology, and today we are going to be discussing the temperaments and how they relate to political compass alignments. Why? A, because I can. B, because it's moderately useful. So let's get right into this. So in my last video, I talked about how each temperament had one side of each axis, and there are three axes total. So when discussing the political compass and temperament, we can almost throw out the concrete versus abstract one. But then if we take a look at the affiliative versus pragmatic axes, well, this axis is the one that actually correlates the most with political compass alignments. And this is because this axis can essentially be laid over the authoritarian versus libertarian axes on the political compass. And why this is because affiliative types are the types that are more likely to place trust in authority, while pragmatic types don't really care about authority. And this, of course, is due to the whole thing of affiliative types doing what's right while pragmatic types do what works. In a political context, for example, with, let's just say, drugs, an affiliative type might say it's better to outlaw it because it could hurt people who are using it, while a pragmatic type would just say they should be allowed to do it as long as it's not hurting anyone but themselves. By figuring out whether someone is affiliative or pragmatic, you can quickly figure out which temperament they are and also what they most likely are politically in terms of how strong the government should be. Though you also have to take into mind that with subconscious development or shadow development might adapt the preferred ideology of another type, which is a type of their subconscious or their shadow. So an ISFJ, for example, might be more libertarian because they have a strongly developed ENTP subconscious. And now moving on to the economic axis, well, this correlation is a little more variable. And basically, the first correlation here is that systematic types, which are SJs and NTs, are more likely to be economically right-wing than interest types, which are NFs and SPs. The reason that this is much more variable than the authoritarian versus libertarian axis is firstly, well, it just seems that in the modern day, it doesn't matter which type they are, most people are just left-wing for some reason. And the second reason we'll discuss after my next point, because you know that bit. Basically, interest types are more likely to be left-wing because of the whole way they work. They're very motive-based, and it's about what's in it for you, what's in it for me, and that whole attitude generally seems to economic equality more than systematic types. Because in the eye of a systematic type, it's more likely that it'll be like, oh, well, if you follow this step-by-step process and are able to be good at the system, you'll do really well in it, and hence the systematic types are going to be more capitalist on average, while the interest types might be more socialist on average. I'd also like to know right now that it's definitely not as significant here for the censors, because there's a ton of left-wing SJs and a ton of right-wing SPs. It's definitely a lot more significant with the intuitives, however, but then that's just because intuitives are a lot more into this kind of stuff usually, since the political compass is a pretty abstract concept. And now, after putting all the parts of the structure in place, we get this. The four temperaments each correspond to a different quadrant of the political compass. Sort of, because the correlation for each temperament in their quadrant varies in how strong it is, as you'll see here. Starting with the strongest correlation, we have the NTs and the libertarian right quadrant. While this is the strongest correlation, there's still a ton of NTs who are left-wing, and that's due to the fact that, well, there's just more left-wing people in general, and there's also a fair amount of authoritarian right NTs. But overall, if you look at the type breakdown of people who tend to be libertarian of some kind, it's a lot more NTs than you'd find in any other ideology. And it makes sense when you think about it, because the whole approach of the NT temperament, which is pretty independent and always trying to come with a new system that's better, it's one that very much focuses on entrepreneurship and other things like that, and that generally falls in line with libertarian right philosophies usually. So that's that. For our next strongest correlation, we have the NFs and the authoritarian left quadrant on the other side of the compass from the NTs. I'd say a good portion of them are also in the libertarian left quadrant, but if you were to do a population breakdown for what percentage each type is in each of the quadrants, you'll notice that the authoritarian left quadrant has a higher percentage of NFs overall than the libertarian left quadrant. That's of course due to the fact that NFs are more affiliative. But there is still a huge amount of NFs in the libertarian left quadrant, and there's also a fair amount of authoritarian right NFs, such as Alex Jones, who is an ENFP. And the reason for the NFs being more authoritarian left is because they take a different approach to change from the NTs. NTs are all about systematic change, which means being more independent and changing the systems because the system is the rules and what people view as normal or right, and the NTs are trying to challenge that. While the NFs, on the other hand, to create social change, well, that often requires being more fair to people, and that tends to mean more equality or being more commune focused and like that whole sort of thing. So yeah, that's the intuitives. Oh wait, speaking of that, the libertarian left quadrant being the secondary quadrant for all intuitive types probably explains why people tend to say libertarian left is where intuitives are. Another big factor is the fact that regular politics only really deals with the libertarian left and the authoritarian right quadrant, because the left wing is libertarian left while the right wing is authoritarian right. And also, of course, there's that whole thing of people just being more left wing in general, so for the NTs, you don't get the libertarian right correlation from people as much as they would. And now moving on to sensors, we have the second weakest correlation, which is the SJs in the authoritarian right quadrant. Now this is actually almost as strong as the NFs in the authoritarian left quadrant, but it's slightly weaker, and many years ago I would have made this the second strongest correlation. But after looking into it, you'll find that there's a ton of authoritarian left SJ types, and there's also a few libertarian ones too, but like I said, that's more due to developments of the other side of the mind. SJ types are also the most likely of all the types to stay within the Overton window, so you'll see a lot less percentage of SJ extremists compared to, say, NT extremists. This also has to do with the fact that the SJ types are the normal types in society, and because of that, they kind of are the Overton window. And lastly, but not leastly, we have the SP types. Over here, well, it's actually evenly distributed enough that it's more so just spread across the libertarian section of the compass. But there is a tiny percentage higher of libertarian left than all the rest because, again, they're interest-based. There is also a few authoritarian SPs, but again, just like with the SJ types, it's because they might have developed the other sides of their minds. In this case, that would most likely be the shadow, since SPs have an SJ shadow while SJs have an SP shadow. But overall, SPs are most likely going to be a libertarian quadrant of some kind, with a preference for the libertarian left quadrant, and that's due to their more tribalist approach to anarchy. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, a like and a comment would be appreciated, and even more appreciated would be a subscription, which would be super awesome, and new content is on its way soon.